Lampariello, an internationally respected polyglot, language coach, and speaker, and he's joining us today. Luca's mastered over a dozen languages, probably even more, and has helped thousands of learners transform their approach to language learning. So he's known for his smart, intuitive techniques, his deep focus on bridging comprehension and expression. And Luca brings a unique blend of academic insight and personal experience to everything he does. Also, he's the voice behind one of the most insightful YouTube channels, and that's my opinion as well. And he blogs in the in the language learning community. So whether you're a beginner or a seasoned linguist, you'll take something valuable away today. So Luca, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Ben. Thank you for the lovely introduction.
No, you're welcome. It's great to have you on here, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what you got to share. So, first of all, I'd like to start off with obviously your language journey is widely admired, including by myself. But what sparked your initial passion for languages, and how did it evolve into the method that you're known for today?
I think it all started back in the day when I was sitting in my garden. It was a summer house of my family back in, I think, 1990 or 1991. I don't remember exactly. But my grandmother, she was sitting at a veranda and she said, "Come over, let's do some Latin, French, and mathematics." Can you imagine, like, this child who's like 10, who's supposed to play on the beach with his friends, and instead he's doing mathematics, French, and Latin. And I think that I have to thank my grandmother and my aunt and my father and my mother for fostering this endless curiosity towards the world. Really, I think it all started with this deep curiosity of reading, understanding the world, and mathematics, and I was young enough, receptive enough to the message that my grandmother first, and then my family, my parents conveyed, and that is like, if you read, if you study languages, if you understand math, if you understand how the world works, then you're going to be a better person and a better citizen of the world. And that is really what made a difference at the beginning. This They sparked a curiosity in me. They just instilled this thirst for knowledge, and languages is one of the many things that I love. And when I started, I never stopped. Once I started, it's just an ongoing process. It's probably gonna last for the rest of my life. When they ask me how many languages do you want to learn, I say I'm never gonna stop. So
Ah,
probably if I live long enough, or I don't know, I'll be reading, I'll be listening, I'll be studying languages even when I'm old.
yeah. No, that's great. Obviously, like I've I've got two daughters, and my wife is saying about the importance of speaking to them in Spanish to try and instill that right from the start, and hopefully inspire them. But obviously, life takes over, and I forget to frequently. But I think that's something so important that you mentioned about the importance of the input from the parents. That's the first voice you hear, or your grandparents. That's what inspires you. So I probably need to get on with that and make sure I actually do it. But also, like you're saying, going to older age, I think keeping your brain going. That I've been reading a lot about the benefits of that, in terms of what it can actually do for you, and in terms of keeping your brain healthy and building those neurological pathways. And I think there's so much more health benefit to it, as well as the enjoyment of doing it, and what you can build connections wise with people. So
Absolutely. And to this point, I just wanted to add the fact that not only did my parents and especially my grandmother instill this desire of learning, they also set the example. At the age of
yeah,
89, my grandmother, could have just enjoyed life in a different way. Instead of teaching a 10-year-old mathematics and French, she not only was eager to teach me, she spent most of her time learning, sitting
mm,
and learning and doing different things. So that really, in my subconscious mind, was sending the message. It's really important to do that. And she was setting the example. And was in awe and admiration of her will to learn,
mm,
despite her advanced age. And I think
yeah.
setting the example is one of the most important things as teachers, as educators, as language creators, YouTubers, and whatnot. Just setting the example.
Yeah. and you can realize how you can positive. There's a lot about influencers and influencing people at the moment. I think especially young people are very, impressionable. And I think that I do try and think of that a lot as a teacher. What example am I setting? And obviously now being a parent, like, I'm thinking, right, what example am I
Of
setting
course.
for my kids? And I think, yeah, being a lifelong learner is, like your grandmother did for you. She inspired you to do that. And I think that's wonderful, and what a legacy to leave as well. Should be, I
Exactly.
imagine how proud of you should be. So that's wicked. But so you talk about, I've heard you talk about before about the bridge between comprehension and expression. So could you explain what this means, and how learners can kind of practically build that bridge?
So, first of all, I believe in language acquisition, and language acquisition is slightly different from language learning. Now, it might sound the same, but it's not the same. Language acquisition means that you acquire the language at a subconscious level. This is what happens when we learn our own native language, right? We don't know why we've learned it at the ripe age of 5. We just start speaking and communicating without knowing the grammar. We
Yeah,
learn about the grammar once we hit school, once we go to school. And language learning is that nasty thing that happens at school when they try to, you know, to teach you grammar rules, and you try to feed them into your, really try to remember grammar rules, and then you find yourself at a loss when it comes to speaking
it's just
because
horrendous. Yeah.
you tend to think I've learned all these grammar rules and I just can't put sentences together. And actually, you can learn a language and you can acquire a language at the same time as an adult, because primarily we learn, actually get familiar with a language, but we also have to leverage our capacity as adults to read a text, to, for example, to leverage our own mother tongue in order to dissect any
Yeah.
text into your target language.
So you
So
have something to link it to, don't you? Whereas as a child, you don't necessarily as much. You're
exactly.
picking it up. Yeah.
As a child, the mind is a blank state, so to
Hmm.
speak. As a and there's pros and cons. As an adult, of course, you know about the world, you know your native language, so you have to. There's pros and cons.
Yeah.
The native language gets in the way because it's a phenomenon called transfer. Language transfer can be
Hmm.
positive or negative, but you can also leverage the knowledge you have in order to learn faster than you might ever think if you do it the right way.
Yeah.
So this is important to take into account. Now, as to your question about input and output, input is the most important thing because you acquire a language just through understanding messages. So if let's say that Ben, let's say that you want to learn Chinese. Let's give your audience a concrete example. You want to learn Chinese, and you want to acquire Chinese, you want to speak it well, because ultimately what people want is to speak a language fluently for the sake of communicating. Not all of them, maybe most of the the most nerdy types, so to speak, they want to read literature without speaking. But in most cases, people want to speak a language fluently. Now,
Yeah.
here's the trick. Um, Here's where it gets interesting. You have, in order to speak a language fluently, you have to get a massive amount of input first. But input is not enough. You can spend 4 years of getting input, listening, and which is absolutely necessary. You have to start with that
Hmm.
by any stretch of the imagination. But once it comes to speaking, even if you've been listening to Chinese for 4 years, you've been listening, you've been reading, you've been watching TV series, when it comes to speaking, it's difficult to speak because it's the first time. You have to open your mouth, articulate sounds, etc., etc. So what is it that you have to do? Well, first of all, I think language learning as a score is simple but not easy to do. Um, listening and reading at the same time, just reading, just listening, watching with subtitles is absolutely necessary, maybe for 2 or 3 years. But you don't have to wait for 3 years before you open your mouth and speak. In
Hmm.
fact, when it comes to activating the language, I call it bridge, input output bridge. It's really important. I did this today, for example. It's really important to find interesting ways for you to experiment, so that you can, for example, let's say, read and listen to a podcast. You have a text, you have the transcript, you have the podcast, but also, for example, try to activate it by, for example, jotting down some words or some sentences, extracting some interesting words and sentences,
Hmm.
and maybe create a mini speech that relates to the content of the podcast. The same thing for a video. So when it comes to speaking, you don't necessarily have to um, talk to a native speaker immediately, and most people are afraid of that because as adults we have a lot of biases, and we have a lot of mental limitations, limiting beliefs when it comes to speaking. We're afraid of making mistakes. This is all another matter.
Yeah, yeah.
This is due to the school system. But in order to bridge the gap, my suggestion is massive input, and then after 3 months or 4 or 6 months, you start um, creating, finding creative ways, experimenting to find ways to activate the language,
Yeah.
jotting down simple words, taking some the most important words of a podcast or a story of a video, and then forming short sentences, repeating them out loud,
Yeah.
writing things down, on a small notebook. This is what I do all the time. I use
Hmm.
notebooks in order to activate the language. So there's multiple ways in which you can create this bridge between input and output. You can even talk to a tutor if you want. But before you talk to human beings, I will suggest to find creative ways to activate the language. Language learning is a very personal road. There are some universal principles, and the methods are all different and depend on the individual. What I found over the last 34 years, learning languages by myself, but also teaching hundreds of students, because I've been working as a coach before establishing my Smart Language Learning Academy, is that the most successful learners are those who are creative in the way they learn. They just
Yeah.
listen to the advice out there, but then they say, "Oh, I like this. Let's take it. Let's try it. I don't like this. Let's discard it." They
Hmm.
constantly experiment and adjust, and
Yeah,
that
yeah,
is
yeah.
what really makes a difference.
Mm. I think the thing that I realised in the last few years of teaching in school is so I don't know if it's the same in Italy or other places, but the expectation was always initially that you would within a lesson even that you would be able to learn something, practice it, and then apply it within an hour, and it's just completely mad like that. And that principle still carries through in a lot of schools here, and I can't believe that it hasn't moved on. But what we actually do now, and in the school I'm in now, using the EPI method, for example, is loads and loads of input. We flood with input to begin with, and then we gradually then build that output. But the main thing is, if you think of it as a principle as a child, you're not at age 2 starting to produce loads and loads and loads of language. You're listening to loads of language and producing bits. And I think that really ties in with that. But also what you're saying about how you prepare kind of those phrases that you want to say, and how you kind of pick up those key bits. That's when I was in Spain, because I had to kind of pick it up quite quick. I actually used to do that. I was ended up in a lot of situations translating for my parents, for example, in situations a 13-year-old wouldn't normally end up in. But I'd prepare in my head. I'd prepare or written down what I'd want to say, my conversation. I'd go, right, if I'm going to say this, they'll quite possibly say that. So I'll have that bit prepared. And I think it's that. So then you have your stock go-to things, and then you gradually add to it, don't you? So I think that's,
Of course,
from a personal perspective, that's what I ended up doing as a 13-year-old
because it was a
to get
necessity for
by.
you, right? It was a
Yeah,
necessity for
yeah,
you, and I think that if you find creative and interesting ways to signal to your brain that that language is important, so you try to activate the language, then your brain is going to pick up the language. We're going to start learning how to speak the language much faster. The problem is that we live in a world where we have the luxury of learning languages by ourselves here. Like for example, here I'm in Italy, and if I
mm,
had to learn, say, I don't know, Korean, and I had to learn it by myself here, then I would not um, necessitate, I would not need to speak Korean immediately. So I might wait for 3 or 4 years because there's a lot of factors involved, like, for example, the fear of speaking, which is a really common thing. And then some people spend maybe sometimes too much time um, listening and reading because then they get within their comfort zone. They don't want to get out of
yeah,
their comfort zone. So
yeah,
I think there's language learning, like any skill acquisition process, happens in phases. The first phase for me, as far as I'm concerned, because everyone is different, is to spend 3, 6, 9, even 12 months um, massively, getting massive input because I have fun. I can do it every day. It doesn't depend on other people,
yeah,
and it gets the language in me. And another important point, Ben, that you were touching upon is the fact that people ask and demand that, for you were talking about. Um, we teach people at school, or children are taught something, they're expected to speak or use it immediately, which is really difficult because our brain has there's different levels. There's the
mm,
subconscious level, which is really, it's powerful, it's deep, but it's slow. And
mm,
then you have the superficial level, that is learning, that is fast and gives you the illusion that you're learning fast, but you're not absorbing you're not really absorbing the language. To give you a
Yeah.
very clear example of that is that there's a lot of people, and recently two students of mine who came and said, "Oh, I've learned somewhere from the internet, from some YouTuber, that you have to learn the first 2,000 words and then you have to apply it immediately." Now, the problem is you can do that, you can learn these, but this is superficial learning. Like they can use it and they can give the impression that they master these words, but if you don't listen, so if this goes to the detriment of actually getting exposure to the language, what happens is that they might get good at using these words in some situations, but then they might get lost, or they might
Yeah.
get lost when it comes to understanding, even speaking, and then the learning curve literally stops or
Mm.
stalls, and then they find themselves at a loss. They ask themselves, "What is happening? Like I followed this piece of advice, but I'm not learning it." This is
Yeah.
because it's learning, it's superficial, it's uh, it's managed by what is called declarative memory, which is one part, while the subconscious part, the acquisition part, is managed by the procedural memory, which is where we store procedures like
Yeah.
riding a bike, learning to drive a car, speaking
Hmm.
our native language, which happens at a subconscious level. That's why when you speak your own native language, you don't think about the next word.
Yeah.
Everything is managed by your brain directly.
Mm. No, no, yeah, exactly. And it goes back to again why the acquisition is more powerful. Ultimately, if you want to actually be able to communicate in it, not just kind of have it there in a useless way. So,
Yeah.
but talking about your language learning, because obviously, like I said, I think I'm not sure how many languages you speak now because you keep adding to it, so it's hard to keep up with.
Well, it's a tricky question because it really depends on what you mean by speaking. But I always answer, I have been learning 16 languages. Let's put it this way:
Yeah,
some languages I speak well, some other languages I speak them at a lower level. It's only normal because when you manage a lot of languages, something's got to give.
yeah,
As they say, in some of my children, because I consider them family members, they are in the back burner, so to speak, because I can't handle all the children. All the 16 children is impossible. They're running around,
yeah,
and it's impossible to control control of the situation.
yeah. But I think, yeah, I think the act of actually doing it as well. With, like, say for example, you go to a country and you can even communicate in a few phrases.
Of course.
I mean, I've seen something where I've seen a map. I don't know if you've seen it. There's a map of like Europe or something in a different language that's spoken, how different people react to you speaking their language. So, for example, Spaniards, when you speak their language, you become their best mate and they instantly take you in. Whereas French people kind of look at you like, why are you doing that? Why don't we just speak in English? There's different reactions from people. But
Yeah,
I think
absolutely.
on the whole, if you attempt to try and you have a go at it and you try and get your point across, I think there's more often than not an appreciation from that person you're talking to, and you build something deeper straight away. So I
Yeah,
think even like you said, even if you're not mastering, I think it's amazing that you're doing that. 'Cause I think I mean, it's crazy how many people you can actually communicate versus
absolutely.
someone. Yeah,
Hungarian polyglot kato lomber lom kato, as the Hungarians say, used to say that language is the only thing that is worth learning, even if poorly. So when you speak a language, even a little bit bits and pieces of language in some cultures where it's not expected that you speak the language, either because it's exotic or because nobody learns it, people are overjoyed. They're super happy about that. But in some other cultures, instead, maybe the French culture is a little bit different. You're expected to speak the language and to speak it well.
yeah,
And let me tell you, I've had a lot of a lot of interesting experiences, especially when it comes to France, because I lived there and lived within a French family for a while. I had a French girlfriend, and yes, you are expected to speak the language really well.
yeah.
And in contrast with other cultures, like in Turkey, I've never been to Turkey, but I've interacted with some Turks recently, and I spoke just a few words, and they went like, "Oh my God, you speak Turkish!"
Mm,
They were so happy. So it people are appreciative of the fact you're learning, even if you say a couple of things, it puts a smile on people's faces. And I can tell you, Ben, that I've had amazing experiences where, well, I would say the taxi drivers are the category
yeah,
where you see the magic of language learning happen. Literally, I'll tell you this very briefly. I was in Krakow, in Poland, southern
yeah.
Poland, and now I speak Polish. I speak Polish well. I would say at a B2 level, I speak it fluently. And I remember, like, this was happened 2 years ago. I just asked, "Hey, can we can are you free?" And he goes, like, he was very grumpy. He said, "No, he said something. He mumbled something because he thought it was the. I asked him in English at the beginning. And then he didn't know I spoke Polish, of course. And then he was very grumpy. He said, "Okay, okay, let's go," because I had to go to the airport, and he said it was urgent. And then all of a sudden, I started speaking Polish. And from grumpy, from the grumpy granddad that he was, he transformed into the most talkative person. He talked to me about his whole life, communist times, and this,
Yeah.
and completely changed. And at the end of the day, he just like when we were in front of the airport, he said, "You're a good guy. So you have to find a Polish girl and get married because you're a nice guy." So just it goes to show how transformative the act of speaking languages, because that guy could barely speak English. He was very grumpy, and it happened a number of times that I sitting down in a taxi at the beginning. They're really kind of negative,
Mm.
and then but they're negative not because they're negative in general, because they're scared of speaking English. This happened
Yeah.
so many times, and when they
Mm.
realize you speak their language, they open up and they tell you the whole life. They go like, "Oh, this is a rare chance where I can talk to a foreigner who speaks my language." They open
Mm.
up, they tell you their whole life, and it's a beautiful moment.
Especially somewhere like that where it's not a natural language to learn for everyone. So that's yeah.
Exactly.
I think I'm going to. You've inspired me to go away and learn more now. Even if it's just to talk to cabbies, you know.
Well,
So you obviously advocate for smart language learning. So what does it look like in kind of a practical day to day routine for like the average learner with limited time? Because obviously nowadays we try and pack in lots of stuff to our lives. We're non-stop, whether you've got children and you're running around like a headless chicken. But what is the most practical way, would you say, to learn a language from your perspective?
so, well, the first important thing to stress is the fact that language learning happens in phases. So it really depends on whether you're a beginner, an intermediate, or an advanced learner. Because if you're a beginner, you do things that are completely different than if you're obviously you're an advanced learner. So I'll try to keep this brief, but in general, when it comes to starting to learn a language, I always use a language learning material for beginners. I don't know if you ever heard of Asimil or Teach Yourself. These are small books that contain dialogues, short dialogues in
Hmm.
both languages with a vocabulary and some grammar notes that help you explain the grammar points that might be obscure at the beginning, because when you as a beginner you don't know much about the language. Then once I've done one of these, I've gone through these. I use a technique which is called a bidirectional translation, which is not just listening and reading, but again, going back to the point I was touching upon before, it's a comprehensive and organic way to tackle all the micro skills like listening and reading at the same time, translating in from the target language into my native language in writing, and then
Mm.
translating back a few days later, so that space-time repetition,
Yeah.
recalling, they're all included. It's a very active, proactive, organic way to learn the basics, the foundation of a language, and then I move on to podcasts and videos. In particular, I can show you here, but people are listening. I will describe it. This
Hmm.
is a transcript of this is one of the languages I'm learning right now
Right.
actively, Hungarian. I have let's say a B1 plus level. This is a transcript of a podcast by
Right.
um, Hungarian with Cici, who's one of my favorite content creators for
Hmm.
Hungarian. And I just have here again, you notice that it's written and it's on paper. It's on paper
Hmm.
because I always use paper and pencil. I
Yeah.
listen and I read. Then I translate this. I copy the PDF into DeepL or Google Translate, and I listen to the text, for example, in
Mm.
Italian, so that I can immediately understand while I listen to my native language, I can immediately understand it.
Yeah.
So once I understand this, then I just listen in Hungarian while I read in Hungarian, marking words, etc. And it's
Mm.
incredibly simple and incredibly effective. This
But
is
also,
like
what you're doing as well, you're learning, you're doing it in a way that interests you. You've created your, like you said, about creating your own way that interests you, that resonates with you. And I think that's really interesting.
so here's where it gets interesting. Now I know we don't have the time to go through this, but I run a lot of experiments with this. This is one example with Hungarian. This is another. This is a podcast that I downloaded. But this, and we're going to talk about. I know that for a fact that you're going to ask me about AI, but this is a podcast that is in Turkish. So in Turkish, I'm doing something similar. I have an A2 level, so I've just gotten into the low intermediate phase. because I've already done Asimil and some other language learning materials for beginners. And then what I do is that I create my own podcast. So, for example, I choose a very interesting video on YouTube. In this case, it's the Fermi paradox, which is a very famous paradox about cosmology, about ancient, extraterrestrial civilizations. And I just feed it to a Notebook LM. I don't know if you ever
Oh
heard
yeah,
of Notebook
yeah, yeah,
LM.
yeah.
And it creates a podcast that is ideal for my level and
That's
that is
yeah. I find that
about
fascinating. That thing.
not only is it about my level, it's 7 minutes, it's perfect audio, but it gets even more interesting than this. If I upload the same source, the same YouTube video into the system in another browser, it creates another podcast which is about the same topic, slightly different. So I can create three of these and then just listen to. So I have the same topic
Yeah,
attacked from different angles, and
different. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I can listen to this in a week three of them, and I'm learning words. This is, you can see here again, people are not. This is
Hmm.
B. So this is the second version. Then
Yeah,
tomorrow
yeah.
I'm gonna do C. And by doing B after A, I realized that I already had internalized many words like galaxy, speed
Hmm.
of light, and all the vocabulary that is related to this one topic. And I'm having a world of fun
Yeah,
because I'm listening to stuff I love. It's at my level. I listen. I find a way that is creative and fast in order to understand the content immediately by listening to it in Italian while I read it in Turkish, and then I just read and listen in Turkish. Once I've marked all these words, which again you guys cannot see, but while I listen to it in Italian, I mark all the words on a piece of paper,
yeah.
the meaning in Italian, so the text is already very clear. And
Mm,
once I've done that, I can just absorb it.
yeah,
Think of it this way, going back to what I was saying before, language learning and language acquisition is like language learning is like setting up the table and chewing the food. So it depends on what you eat, how you eat it. But acquiring is the digestion that happens after that. You can't
yeah.
control it. The only thing you can do is set the table, choose the food, the right
Hmm.
food, and then the digestion is going to be handled by the stomach. But you have to set up the table and you have
Yeah.
to find the right stuff because this is extremely simple to do. You just expose yourself to language, you learn it in an active way, in a way you like, but most people don't do it. They spend
Mm,
their time using Duolingo, for example, which is very, I don't know if Duolingo has changed or evolved, but I've never used apps, I've never used flashcards because it's not necessary.
mm,
It's really not. You can use them. It will be the cherry on top if you know how to use them well. But
yeah.
at its core, language learning is about consuming a lot of content that you're interested in an interesting way, 30 to 45 to 60 minutes a day, and do it for a long time. And the
Yeah.
magic is going to happen. Of course, after that, you also have to find creative ways to speak the language, activate the
Mm,
language. But this is the base.
yeah. So I'll come back. I will come back to AI because I think that's a that's a very very interesting topic in a moment. But with what you were saying with how much time you need to spend on language, obviously, it's, you coach a lot of adults but in school. It's quite difficult when with given limited time with their classes. So, is there any kind of advice you would give to language teachers in that school setting who are maybe getting twice a week contact with their students, sometimes even less? What would you be able to sort of what advice be able to give, both from motivation perspective and also using their time well?
Well, going back to what I was saying before about talking when I was talking about my grandmother, I think that the very first thing is to set the example. When it comes to my the figures, the family figures, towering family figures, I would say, are the figures where that they were very passionate about learning. But at school, my French teachers actually, middle school and high school, they were very passionate about teaching, and you could feel it. You can feel when someone is interesting and because they're interested.
Mm,
So they were not only interested in teaching, they were also interesting people because they were very passionate about French literature. They were reading books about that, and that you could actually feel it. Now that's the first thing. So setting the example is really important. But I would argue that the other maybe the most important thing is actually to find ways to foster the children's interest into learning the language. Because if you get them interested, they will learn by themselves. Stephen
yeah.
Krashen is a very famous linguist. He talks about the fact that the most important, maybe the most powerful weapon we have in our arsenal to learn a foreign language is voluntary reading. Now the problem is fewer and fewer people read books because of technology taken over. But if you can get a child, or I don't know, a 5, 6 year old child, could be 11, 12, if you get them interested in the language, then everything changes. Now, I don't know how things are done in your school, but if I were a teacher, the very first thing I would do is to show them the culture, show them movies. If they're not, if they, for example, don't have a good level, you can always break down short YouTube videos and explain for YouTube videos that are that are related to the culture of the country, fun videos, anything that is interesting potentially, and that is not doesn't sound like you're imposing anything
Yeah.
upon them, like
Yeah.
having to do this or having to do that. Like I say, hey, today let's do this fun exercise, and they're going to watch something or even going to do something. I think, and the third element is that language learning is a personal road. If you give 20 children the same topic for everyone, that is going to be tough, because some people
Yeah.
could not care less about certain topics while other people might be very interesting. And you might actually retort, yeah, but then it makes the lesson really difficult. What about, for example, creating 40 topics, and then you get they choose what they want to read? Let me give you an example of a reading session. If you get them interested in reading, then you can anybody can choose anything they want. You give them the possibility, whether you're using a tablet or you have different options. They have different pieces of paper. The most important thing is that they do stuff they're interested in.
Mm.
So if something is standardized and, oh, today let's talk about this topic, you're going to lose 80% of the people, because 80% of these people are going to think about something else because they're not interested in the topic. Um, there's many other things I could talk about this forever, because I'm very passionate about education. I don't know if you ever heard of the Finland model. Until the 40s and the 50s, Finland was one of the worst countries in education, and then everything changed once they changed their education system. Now they're among the best in the world because there are no grades. They don't have to do any homework, and
Yeah, I think I read about this the other day, how they've completely transformed it there. I can't. Yeah, I think it was a recent article I read about that. But yeah.
You can see Michael Moore. Michael Moore has a documentary on
Okay.
YouTube. You can watch on YouTube, and if you type Michael Moore Finland, you will see he goes to Finland and he asks a question. He's bewildered by the answers. Like, you don't have any homework, you don't have this, you don't have that. And the thing is that we function, and we've been living in this environment for so long that we take things for granted within education. But education, the entire education system, is based on a paradigm that was maybe good in the 19th century during
Mm.
the Industrial Revolution. It's really really old, you know. For lack of a better term, within the normal circumstances and standards of modern life, and considering the technology we have.
Yeah.
So we tend to be, just to give an example, we tend in school, people tend to foster competence and performance over communication and collaboration.
Absolutely.
And that's what children do. Children collaborate, they play, they don't think about the results, but they get the results because the main shift is not the results themselves. Well,
Hmm.
we live in a world where, as children, we are conditioned, still conditioned to this day, to think in terms of performance. Think about when you have to do public speaking. Think about when you have to speak in a foreign language. We're constantly afraid of judgment. This comes from the subconscious layer that unfortunately has been fostered, and this monster that was spawned at school. And this reflects, unfortunately, is has a huge echo in the way we live, not just in the way we learn foreign languages. So just to give
Mm.
an idea, Finland has removed partially, not completely, all that, and the children thrive in languages, in second language acquisition, among other things, because they don't worry about being judged or getting good grades. They're just worried about learning, which is a major paradigm shift, because you tend to think the school system is about learning. Yeah, but in
Mm.
reality, the school system is based and constructed in order to create, let's say, individuals that will produce stuff for society, for the governments. I know
Yeah.
that this might sound controversial, but that's exactly how it is.
Exactly that. Our whole system is geared towards being able to pay more tax into the system, isn't it?
That's exactly right.
And it's a
That's
shame.
exactly right.
It's a shame.
We don't think outside of the box. We think in the box. We're conditioned to think in the box. And second language acquisition, there's so many, unfortunately, so many biases and so many misconceptions that come from poor education, the poor education system we are just living in.
Yeah, and we just yeah, it's a shame we're having to accept it. The only thing I try and do in my classroom, I always say to students about, you know, we I'm preparing them for exams because I have to, but the actual main aim of what we're doing is to be able to use it for the purpose of a life skill and
Of
a really
course,
valuable life skill. I do I think it's really important for language teachers to say that to students because ultimately that is the thing. It doesn't matter what grade it says on your bit of paper. When you're standing in front of someone trying to communicate with them, that is going to take you so far in life in terms of how you learn to communicate with different people and all that sort of thing. I think that's saying it's
absolutely.
missed that the teaching to an exam is just absolutely horrendous, and it is such a shame that everything is geared towards that, and there's so much judgment on that as well.
That's exactly right.
Um,
And that's also the reason why I've been learning 16 languages because I've learned it outside of school. I figured out very early that the main reason why I was learning languages was for myself, by myself and for myself, and not just to, to get good grades. So I couldn't care
mm,
less about the grades I was getting at school. I was more focused on, soaking it all in,
mm,
as they say. And that's why I've learned outside of the system because the system was too slow. And the other thing that I wanted to add is the fact that the human being has such a huge potential because we have an amazing brain. So when people tell me, "Oh, you must be a genius because you speak 16 languages," I just tell them, I just learned how to use the potential, the potential of my brain as an individual. Any individual in the world can learn as many languages as possible. Of course, we're limited in time and space. That's the main limitation. We're mortals, but the potential of learning as many languages you want is there. Then whether you want it or not is a different matter.
yeah,
But it's not only possible, we're wired to learn languages well. It's just that we do it backwards, and we're taught to do it backwards at school. And then that, of course, has tremendous uh, negative consequences for the rest of our lives if we don't just
yeah,
learn how to do it correctly.
absolutely. So I wanted to go back to the AI thing. Obviously, that's very prominent. I've been listening to loads of stuff about AI recently. Um, what's your take on it? I personally, I feel like you know we need to get on board with it, and I think there can be extremely positive ways it can be used. Obviously, there's lots of risks and stuff, but I'm constantly trying to think of how you can harness it and actually use it for a positive language learning experience. What is your take?
I can tell you that well, there's a lot to unpack there. I'd first say that like the internet can be very negative, can be very positive. If you open YouTube, you can spend 10 hours looking at trash or 10 hours learning. So it really depends on
Yeah.
how you use it. AI is a tool, and it depends on how human beings use it rather than the tool itself. So it's not whether AI is positive or negative. I'm
Yeah.
talking about language learning. Then if we talk about the future of humanity, that's a different matter. It's
Yeah.
more like a philosophical
Let's
problem
leave that
because
to someone else.
let's leave it at that. But just to make a long story short, what I think is that it really depends on how you use it. Now, in my case, I can tell you it's been a complete revolution because let's say that AI has just enhanced the stuff I was doing before. Just to give an example, the one example I gave you is
Yeah.
the podcast. As of now, I'm creating my own podcast, and I'm pretty sure that in a matter of a few months or a year, you'll be able to create your own videos. So create your own language learning videos with double subtitles and
Yeah.
whatnot. This is a revolution because when it comes to acquiring a language, you have to find stuff that is interesting. Now, a lot of people complain, "Oh, I can't find interesting stuff." Now you can. There's no more
Mhm.
excuses. You can create your own ad hoc podcast in terms of, again, podcasts, videos, texts. You can translate text. You can ask ChatGPT to create a bilingual text, maybe line by
Yeah.
line. You
Yeah.
can ask ChatGPT to create a list of words and then create stories so that you can repeat the same content or the same words.
Mm.
And when it comes to speaking, and for example, you can use amazing tools. One I've been using is called Langua, and I always talk about this because it's amazing. I've been using it to improve. I just talk to the AI, which is really good. It replies in real time. It gives you a PDF, it gives you corrections, gives you cultural references. So when it comes to speaking, writing, reading, listening. It's an incredible revolution. And again, unfortunately, due to the lack of time, we can't talk in detail about that. But
Mm.
it has changed everything in the way I do it. My students at the academy do it because it's just enhancing what you've already been doing. So it's improving what people are already doing. So if you already know how to learn a language, the foundation, you have good techniques that you like, and you experiment and you find ways that to listen, read, etc., that you like. The AI is only going to improve that.
Yeah.
On the other hand, if you rely too much on AI, that can be a double-edged sword.
Hmm.
So the bottom line is AI is nothing short of a game changer, but again, you have to understand how to learn a language. If you don't understand how to learn a language in the first place, it's like having an amazing weapon, but you don't have the instructions on how to use it,
Yeah.
and you might shoot yourself in the foot. So it's really important to understand first the universal principles that govern the process of learning or languages as a skill. And if you know that, then AI can be an amazing thing.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it's another sort of tricky one is going to be how that can be converted to the classroom as well, because there's lots of conversations going around at the moment. The problem
Of
is as
course,
well, lots of the people who are leading on languages in the country don't know themselves how to use it. So it's going to be, I guess, an experimental phase that we're going to go through, where we have to go, right, what is actually useful, what are we, how can we, ultimately young people are going to be they're going to be the experts at this. How can we actually harness that and go, right, how are we going to use this effectively in the classroom as well? I think
of course,
there's so much it will be able to do that. Yeah, if we know how to use it, then I think it could be really really beneficial. So
of course.
I just think that that podcast creation, what's it called, the LM one you were saying about, no,
Notebook
but
LM.
no, but LM, yeah, I think that's just incredible. I mean, I think my dad made a podcast about himself being a PGA golfer or something.
It's amazing. It's amazing. And
he,
now
and he's not.
and now you can yeah, and now you can do it in many languages. I've uploaded my own book. I've uploaded my own YouTube videos because I found
Mm,
them interesting
yeah,
about topics I'm interested in. So it's just mind blowing. You can do it in so many
nice.
languages. You can create a transcript out of that. So just think about a couple of tools where you can create all the podcasts you want about the
Yeah,
topics you want, and also have the transcripts, just to give you an idea of what is
definitely.
possible just for input. Imagine the rest.
Yeah. So on a lighter note, obviously being learning languages, I find always brings out funny moments. Have there ever been any standout funny moments or lost in translation moments in your language learning journey or your career?
Before I reply, I have to connect this, otherwise the computer's gonna die on me.
Oh no,
Yeah, you don't want that to happen.
don't let
Okay,
that
we
happen.
just saved by the bell. Let's see if we're saved by the bell. Yeah, I think so. Okay, so you were saying about the funny moments. I can
Yeah, have
I
you ever
can
had a moment in your language learning or your teaching career that has been a standout funny moment?
I think I've had a lot of different moments. I would call them awkward sometimes more than funny. Just awkward means that you think you're saying something else, or I mean, there's so many that I really can't I can't pinpoint one, but I can tell you that it's language learning is a matter of getting out there and getting out of your comfort zone. So
Yeah,
whatever is funny or awkward, or something that you might be ashamed later, don't be ashamed, because it's bound to happen. Awkward moments are bound to happen, funny moments are bound to happen, but also amazing moments are bound
yeah.
to happen. Just to give you an idea of some of the serendipitous things that happened in my life. I was once sitting around the fountain, because in the summer we sit around the fountains in Rome, and we gather
Mm.
around fountains in Trastevere, which is a neighborhood just next to my own neighborhood. And I was talking to my friends, and all of a sudden I hear this loud burp from behind, and I just turn around and say, "That was one loud burp." And I said it exactly this way in English, and I became friends with one of the people who was sitting there. It was a guy and a girl. The girl had burped, not the guy, by the way. And his name is Garrett. He's American. He's from Philadelphia, Philly, and we became very good friends. And this gives you an idea of, because they once I said, "Oh, that's one loud burp," they asked me, "Oh, are you American or Italian? Why you speak English with this American accent?" And it all sparked this conversation that lasted for the entire night. and then we hit it off really well, and then we became friends. So this is just one example of
Yeah.
many, 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 you know, things that happen in my life due to language learning, due to the fact that I speak languages. And of course, on the other hand, there were also awkward moments. Another example of that, it was Easter, and I had just known my Polish ex girlfriend, and I was visiting, and I had to meet the parents. And someone asked me point blank something I did not understand. It was a very awkward moment of silence. And you have to, in that microsecond, you have to decide whether I'm just going to be an imbecile and just going to say something that has nothing to do with the question, or I'm just going to just avoid saying anything and look like an idiot. So you're not left with much of a choice. And of course there's also again funny moments where you were misunderstood, and then you clarify the stuff, or you said something interesting. I can tell you of a friend of mine who was in Paris, and he said in French, est-ce que je peux avoir des salopes, s'il vous plaît? So this means, can I have some hookers instead of steaks? So he said, can I have, est-ce que je peux avoir des salopes? But he wanted to say the escalope. Escalope is steaks, and
Yeah,
the waitress was obviously not happy with that.
she
And
didn't. She didn't serve them in a restaurant.
I don't know what happened later, but I can tell you that was quite a moment.
Oh
Just
my
like
gosh.
wide eyed, like
Yeah,
deer in the lights, and yeah, but yeah,
but it creates those moments. At least he tried it. At least he went for it.
of course, but and this is a very good point. It's better to say something and get it wrong rather than not saying anything and not learn at all. But
Yeah,
again, we live in an environment. We live we had to go through the school system where some of you maybe are in the school system where it's not creativity, getting out of the comfort zone and making mistakes that are fostered. They're actually stigmatized. If
yeah,
you make a mistake, everybody's going to laugh, and they're going to remember that for the rest of your life, or making a fool out of yourself. Well, you're not making a
yeah.
fool out of yourselves. Sometimes people restrain themselves from asking questions when you could ask even the most stupid question, but it's better to ask a stupid question than
Absolutely,
not asking it,
definitely. And that's saying I said to one of my classes earlier today. I said because I think I asked a student. I sort of said, "Oh, can you try and say this in the language, like in Spanish or something?" And they just sort of stood there looking at me. I was like, it doesn't matter. I don't mind if you get it wrong. I really like said no good conversation has ever happened with two people just staring at each other. It doesn't go that well. It's about getting something across. I think I used to listen. Remember Michel Thomas? Do you remember those things? So he said once. I think he said it's a tennis analogy about getting the ball across the net. It's not about winning the point always. It's about getting the ball across the net. It's about getting some kind of point across. And I think
of
it's
course.
losing that fear. I mean, that is I think one of the biggest things you can conquer is losing the fear of getting it wrong. And as
I
soon as
agree.
you,
I agree. But it's so ingrained in the way the society works. It's so ingrained. Like imagine a child who's the problem is that the child sees, observes their parents, and their parents are scared. They have the same paradigms because they absorbed in school. So it's something that is passed from generation to generation. It's not something that just relates to language learning. It's just like, for example, maybe a child does something different, and the parent punishes the child for doing something different,
yeah,
for expressing his creativity. There's Ken, I think his name is Ken Robertson. I might get this wrong, but there's a guy. He passed away. Unfortunately, he's British, and lovely guy. Made an amazing TED talk. If you write something like "Why School Kills Creativity," you will see it. It's one of the best talks I've ever. He made two, but that is funny. Incredible. He wrote a lot of books as well. And as a teacher, watch it, and for people listening, write "Why School Kills Creativity" TED Talk, and you will see what I'm talking about. Lovely speech, and people laugh because he's an amazing speaker, but he talks about very serious stuff. And in part, we touched upon this: why a child who's one of the most creative creatures in the world is actually not fostered, and his interest is not fostered, is actually the opposite.
mm, yeah.
There's an obstacle and hurdles along the way.
Gradually get rid of their creativity. Unfortunately,
We deprive children of their initial creativity and their initial drive, something that happened with me in part because of school, but I was fortunate enough of having a family, on the other hand, that fostered this. So
yeah,
I lived in an environment where at school I saw the mediocrity of the system applied to the school system, but on the other hand, I came back home and I saw My grandmother reading and doing mathematics. My father very passionate about reading books. So I was very lucky to be in an environment where really I understood the power of learning, and I did it for myself, not because I had to get good grades, and that made it a world of difference.
No, exactly. Yeah, I think it's having, yeah, going back again to that, having someone who inspires you and having that someone to look up to within your journey, isn't it? So finally, one more thing I'd like to ask: if you could go back and give yourself one tip for learning a language from what you first knew, as it when you were younger, when you first started learning languages, what tip would that be to give your younger self?
I would go back to the initial tip of getting a massive input instead of trying to force speaking, because it happened to me. Of course, it happened that I was trying to speak early when I was learning German for the first time, by myself for the first time in 1996 at the ripe age of 15. My suggestion would be to spend time listening, reading, and do stuff that you like, and experimenting as much as you can from the get go. Because once again, you don't speak your way to fluency. You learn by you speak fluently first by listening and reading, and then by input, massive input, and then by speaking. And I think that's the most important thing. But intuitively I've always been doing this one way or another. The time, like 30 years ago, 34 years ago, when I started learning languages, things were a little bit different.
Mm,
No internet, no notebook LM and whatnot, but the principles always stay the same. So as a piece of advice also for the learners out there, the most important thing I think is intrinsic motivation. Intrinsic motivation is when you do something for the because the process in itself is rewarding, and you find it rewarding because it changes your life. And this is something as teachers should know, and learners should know as well. Like, why is it that I haven't learned this language at the end of the day? Is because maybe you didn't want to get there because you knew that getting there requires a lot of time and energy.
mm,
And in order to do that, you have to be intrinsically motivated. You don't learn Chinese just because the neighbor said that Chinese is cool.
yeah.
You learn Chinese because you find the process rewarding and interesting. And then once you do that, then you start doing this every day, and then you don't even think about it. You move from goals to systems,
Mm,
from actions to habits, and it's a different matter. I got to tell you the truth that I don't regret anything. Everything happens for a reason. I don't even regret following a career as an engineer, because I've studied different things. I have a scientific background. My father wanted me to become a mathematician like him. And at the end of the day, I did. I spent a lot of time at university learning mathematics and physics, but I don't regret it because my father used to say languages are tools. They're not the end all be all thing. So tools to live better. And
mm,
but I don't regret anything. I don't regret doing like studying engineering. I don't regret because I could have done just languages for the rest of my life, just
yeah.
from the beginning. I don't regret that. So I would just say that that the piece of advice of leveraging input. And then the other thing, this is more like a piece of advice for everyone. You don't learn language from grammar. You learn grammar from language. Once again, very wise Hungarian polyglot Kato Lom used to say that. There's an amazing book she wrote, which is called
Mm,
How I Learn Languages. Please read it if you can. You can easily find it on the internet and download it, whether it's legal or not.
hmm.
But she describes the once again the fact that we learn grammar from language. Of course, we have to, in order to speak a language well, we have to learn its grammar. It is important, but you can find a balance between consuming content and learning a grammar unconsciously or subconsciously because the brain figures patterns by itself if you give it the right food.
Yeah.
Again, once again, eating,
Yeah.
digesting. And also, you have to learn grammar. You can learn grammar in a deliberate way by reading the rules, but you really understand and absorb the rules once you've gotten enough input. So it works the other way around. This is the other thing I would tell myself, because when I started learning German, it was a disaster. I was just doing grammar, and of course, I was not. It was not making a dent, so to speak. I was just
Yeah.
stuck, and I couldn't get out of it until I embraced the massive
Yeah.
input theory, and I just and
Absolutely.
then you know
Well, Luca, thank you so much. I'm very inspired. I have to say, I think it's fascinating your journey and what you're doing. So it's very much appreciated that you've come on to talk to me today.
Thank you, Ben. It's been my pleasure.
Thank you so much for your time. So thank you for joining us for this episode of Language Sofa podcast, and I'll see you next time.